Thursday the 26th of June, and this is the evening edition of MicAndBike. And I think for this show, I'm going to talk about currencies and inflation and deflation. I think most people in the United States or in the Western world in general are fairly happy with their currencies. The developed world hasn't had any real currency disruptions in quite a while. Developed nations anyway. We haven't seen any big crashes in value of any given currency in decades now, of a major currency. The great inflation of the 1970s in America ended long ago. And even that wasn't terrible compared to what many countries like Brazil had experienced in the past. So I think by and large, there's a, I don't know, shall we say, a feeling, a complacency or a contentment with the status quo with the currencies of the developed world, in at least their stability. If anything, I think the big concerns these days are that, with some people, is that the currencies are too strong. You hear complaints in Europe about how their currency is, the strength of the euro is hurting their competitiveness, particularly in the struggling euro nations like Greece or Spain or Italy, now France, Portugal, I guess. There's a whole list of them. And these struggling nations feel it would be certainly a lot better for them if the currency was weaker. If Greece could devalue their currency, it would mean that foreigners could buy Greek goods at relatively cheaper prices instantly. I don't know. I question how good that would be, whether that would really be better for Greece. Is the ability to devalue your currency really a boon to your economic development and to economic prosperity? I would contend not. Currency devaluations are basically a cheater's way out of social or societal economic problems. The net effect is the same whether you devalue your currency or you keep the currency at a strong rate. If your country simply isn't competitive, then you're not going to be able to command high incomes for your citizens. It's as simple as that. And devaluing your currency might mean that there's employment and you're selling goods, but people are making less money for it, really. in on paper they might be making just as many drachmas or pesetas as they used to, but those pesetas and drachmas aren't worth as many dollars as they were, so your purchasing power declines. So currency devaluations are basically just a convenient way to paper over glaring flaws in your social order and your economy. It's far better to have improved productivity of your nation so that people do buy goods at competitive prices, but you can still command high wages and with a good purchasing power. So I've just never had much sympathy for the frequent calls that we hear over the years from all countries for currency devaluation. America makes it sometimes. They complain about how the dollar is too strong against China or Japan. And sometimes they claim that these other countries are somehow gaming the system by artificially devaluing their currencies. I don't really think that's true in most cases, but even if it was, a country that devalues its currency really just hurts themselves more than anybody else. Just means that their citizens are actually taking pay cuts, and that the currency that their citizens get paid in just don't buy as much as they could have or would have. It's a very bad way to try to fix economic problems. But I can see why it's attractive. It's attractive because it's easy. You don't have to, improving productivity is hard. You can improve productivity in a whole variety of ways. Sometimes by better job work rules, making it more attractive for investment in your country. And you don't get companies investing in productivity improvements if they feel they get a poor value for it. So a company could decide they're not going to build or not build manufacturing or other kinds of services in your country because hiring people is very expensive and they can't fire them when they need to, and there could be all kinds of work rule issues that make it very prohibitively expensive to hire. Employers are willing to pay higher salaries if they know they can easily add and remove staff as they need it. And if they know that, and if the taxes are and social costs are relatively low. fixing those kinds of things are difficult for many countries. Politically untenable. Removing job protection legislation or rules about how many hours people work and so on in a place like France just isn't going to happen. So it would be easier if you could just devalue your currency, because you don't have to go to the voters for that. But that's the cheater's way. And I don't recommend it. Which leads me to my thought about the struggling Euro nations. There's a lot of pundits out there who think that Spain and Greece and Italy would be better off without the Euro. And that they could, if they had their old currencies back, the lira and drachma, they could just devalue them. And that they'd be much better off. And their economies would be better off if they were able to do that. I'm not at all sure that's the case. Yeah, they could devalue, get a quick bump to employment, but as I said, the citizens would their income would drop anyway. Their real incomes. And it doesn't really solve their underlying problems. I go further. I don't think the euro is responsible for or should be blamed for the economic troubles that many European nations are facing. It's not the euro that caused the issues. The problem is that these nations borrowed too much, drove their government debt up to unsustainable levels. The government and private debt that was really unsustainable, that couldn't be self-liquidating. And they ended up with bubbles, property bubbles, and various types of bubbles in their economies that all came crashing down when the debt came to an end. Hello. Thank you. One could argue that without the euro, many of these nations wouldn't have been able to borrow as much money in the first place, so they wouldn't have gotten themselves in much trouble, and that the lending spigot was so generous for about a decade because they were riding off of the euphoria around the euro, and markets were letting countries like Greece and Spain borrow at much lower rates than they ever would have been able to receive under their own currencies. I think there was a feeling that everybody was now Germany. Now, since it was a single currency, there was a single pool of risk, and the powerful nations like Germany and France would make sure that it was all safe and protected. And to a great extent, that has been true. There hasn't been big defaults on sovereign debt in the Euro nations, or even on bank debt. And they've engineered a variety of bailout mechanisms to fund countries like Ireland and Spain and Greece. But it wasn't the euro itself that caused the problems. And that's like saying that's like blaming the car that somebody buys for drunk driving, or when a driver gets drunk driving it. Yeah, if they didn't have the car, they wouldn't have been drunk driving. But is it the responsibility of the auto manufacturer for selling the car, or is it the responsibility of the driver for buying it, or the driver who has it? I do think that investors should have taken bigger hits with the problems in Europe. I think there should have been cuts in sovereign debt. But it didn't happen. Well, Greece had some cuts in their debt, but not in the debt they owed to other countries. Oh, and the European Central Bank bought most of Greece's private debt anyway, consolidated it. So there really wasn't much of a haircut that anybody had to take on Greek debt. Most of Greek debt is held by the European Central Bank. So now I'm going to say something that sounds totally contradictory to what I've been saying. Even though I don't blame the problems in the struggling European nations on the euro, I think the euro was a mistake. And I believe it will be undone. And it will eventually cease to exist. And most of the nations, if not all the nations of Europe that are currently in the euro, will go back to having their own national currencies. But ironically, I think this is primarily because the euro is actually doing the most harm to Germany. It just hasn't become clear to everybody yet. And at least at some point it will. And when the euro starts getting hurt and impacting Germany, then we will see actual interest in dismembering the euro. But it will be from Germany, not from the various nations that are currently struggling. In short, I think we will reach a point where Europe, the Eurozone has went to bail out too far, and there will be some trigger point in one of the struggling nations where they need yet another bailout, and coming up with the money will just be politically untenable in Germany, and the German politicians will just back away. They've pretty much said that now. They've refused to issue euro bonds. They've refused to expand the bailout funds. So I don't really think Germany is any kind of a mood to put more money into bailing out other nations. And unfortunately, I don't think we've reached the end yet of crises in the struggling nations. I think another recession, a global recession, is inevitable. And when such a thing happens, it will put even more pressure on the struggling euro economies, and they will find it even harder to make their debt obligations. There will be even more defaults, and that consequently this will create the need for more money from Germany to handle the bailouts. And this just won't be an option. Neither would Germany accept general devaluations of the euro. That won't go down well in Germany either. So I think the euro is doomed, and it will be doomed from Germany because of sentiment in Germany, not from sentiment in other nations. And the unfortunate thing is that when this happens, there will be lots of anger throughout Europe. Countries will be very angry with each other. Germany will be angry with Germany, and the handful of countries that are doing well, like Finland and so on, will be very angry with the struggling nations. The struggling nations will be angry with the well-to-do nations, and it will create such a ill feeling. The economic fallout will be significant with the rebalancing of the economies and going back to other currencies. And so I think there'll just be deep, deep anger in many of these countries towards one another that won't go away for a long time. So my prediction is that the real legacy of the euro will be to create hostility and mistrust amongst European nations of a magnitude that hasn't existed since the Great Wars. I wouldn't go so far as to predict a war. That seems a little unlikely. But certainly, economic cooperation could come to an end. We could see the EU itself, not just the Euro, but the European Union institutions become dysfunctional as the nations, the various nations and participants find it impossible to get along anymore. The disagreements they have now that require delicate compromises will seem like nothing compared to the disagreements they will face when the euro collapses. Or not collapses, but is simply dismembered. I'm not sure how this will all happen. It could be that Germany just unilaterally withdraws from the euro and issues its own currency. So technically in that situation, all the other euro nations will still have a common currency. But that wouldn't last for long. Almost certainly all of the well-to-do euro nations would withdraw from the euro if Germany did. So there goes Denmark, Holland, Finland, Sweden, gone. They're not in the euro anymore. At least I think Sweden's on the euro, pretty sure. Norway isn't, I don't think. The struggling European nations might not be so quick to leave the euro, but if the euro starts sinking like a rock when Germany pulls out, which I'm pretty sure would happen, then the remaining nations in the euro would leave pretty quick themselves. So it wouldn't exist anymore. The euro would be history. And that's what I think is going to happen within the next 10 years. So by 2025, there won't be a euro anymore. And instead, we'll have a squabbling, vitriolic Europe. America, on the other hand, I think stands to have a strong currency for quite a while. In fact, these problems in other nations will likely strengthen it even more. People will take their money out of Europe or even Asia, because I think Asia's going to have problems. And China's economy will have a major recession. So I think a lot of money will be flowing into America that will keep its currency at a high valuation. On top of that, there is so much private debt in the world denominated in dollars that it acts as a big deflationary machine when there are economic problems. So when the economy is doing poorly, banks start calling in loans, all kinds of lenders start calling in loans, wanting repayment on their money, on the debt, and everybody struggles to get cash to pay off their loans. This means dollars become precious indeed. Everybody wants dollars to pay off their debt. And to get those dollars, they'll sell anything and everything they've got. Sell off their real estate, sell off their commodities, anything that they've got in their portfolios goes out the window in the dash for cash. And the net result is that the dollar appreciates. And this, folks, is called deflation. And that ends tonight's episode of Mike and Bike.